historical fiction writer is, of course, to get your point across, write history in a way that a general audience will understand. Television shows and movies often do this by changing the fashion. Many times the changes are not noticeable to the average audiences, but they drive historians crazy. There are whole mailing list groups, blogs, and YouTube channels dedicated to this. As writers of historical fiction, we have to be aware of the anachronistic changes that we want to make to the time period. What is our purpose in making them? Do they make the story easier for the reader to understand? Come on, there we go. Despite the fact that your story will take place in a date and a time in the past, your story still is fiction. This means you have the responsibility to build your world for the reader. When you're writing, especially if you've done enough research that you're familiar with the time period, it's really easy to take things for granted. However, your reader might be lured into your book because it's about the British Navy during the War of 1812. In reality, they might know absolutely nothing about the British Navy during the War of 1812. But they think it's a neat plot idea and they want to learn more about it. So, you have to consider your audience. How does the British military differ from the American military? How does it differ then from what it is now? What were the living arrangements, social politics, military actions? All of that will need to be explained as you write your book. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you write an entire chapter on whaling harpoons, but giving information about how food is gotten or kept fresh on a voyage over several months, or explaining why you shouldn't light a ship on fire might be a good idea. So the first decision that you're going to make is where you want your story to be set. From there, you get to pick your country and your city. Be sure to use real places unless you're purposefully moving it over into the historical fantasy genre, which is fine. There's nothing at all wrong with the historical fantasy genre, but that decision should be made consciously so that you can be sure your audience knows it too. A short list of potential themes. I know I'm talking to a writing group, so I'm sorry if I'm being redundant. But a short list of potential themes that can be used include ambition, fear, fate, destiny, revenge. An unreliable narrator is always fun. Friendship loss, beating the odds to succeed, etc. The important thing is whatever theme you choose, it has to fit within your setting. For example, if you're writing a coming-to-age story that happens in New York City during the early 20th century, you'd have to consider what the person wants to do in the next phase of their life and how it differs from the opportunities before them. Like the theme, the plot has to make sense for the time period. Generally, the plot will be at least influenced by historical events of that time period. If you're not writing during a specific historical event, then the norms of your main character's place in society and gender at least have to be mentioned. Even if your main character is not adhering to those norms, you'll have to let the reader know what they are so that they can understand how your character or characters are behaving differently and why that makes them so remarkable. Once you have a place and time and theme, your characters should start coming to life for you. They'll each have their own plot line, and hopefully their plot lines will intersect. Keep track of these and make sure that you wrap them up, even if it deviates from your main plot, maybe exceptionally so. Tracing the side plots from beginning to end will add depth of context to your story, and it'll help the reader become even more engaged. And I find this happens a lot for me. I'll fall in love with a secondary character, and I think the main character is nice and all, but I really like this person over here better. So it just adds that depth for you. Just like with theme and plot conflicts, or the plot conflicts between the characters have to be appropriate within the time and place you choose. It's important to tell the reader why this conflict is taking place. Even if you think it's obvious, your reader might not agree with your perspective, or they might not know anything about it. For example, it might seem obvious that the mother of a young child would be upset that her son or daughter is working in a cask in a wine distillery. But if there was never another option, maybe that mother would never consider being upset about it, because to her, it's just a way of life. If your characters are choosing to do something that's not what was considered normal for their time and place, then you'll have to let the reader know what happened to make them see things differently, and and do a comparison of basically a juxtaposition point of what things are, why your character sees them differently, and what your character sees them as. So dialogue can be tricky. Just like we have, different ways of speaking, different accents, different voices we use. Characters should also have a specific way that they speak. Historically, people would speak in different languages altogether. So it'll be up to you if you want to slide in certain words that were specific to that place and time, or if somebody is generally speaking French, but now they're speaking English, if you want to slide in some French words or Italian words or however, to make it appropriate for that specific character. So if you do decide to do this, remember that you must explain what that word means to the reader. So while they might be able to guess from context or just look it up, the goal is to keep them engaged with your story, and breaking the engagement means they can get distracted and then go on to something else. Other topics to consider. This is just a handful. While you're creating a world and a story to go in it, you have to research or at least consider all the little things that people take for granted. To do this, think about the things that you're passionate about, how you feel, those feelings, how you feel about your kids, your family, your friends, your parents, whoever, what you're wearing, what they're wearing. What time do you change for bed, change into your pajamas for bed? What time do you change your kids into their pajamas to go to bed? Think about how you get your news, or where you find out what the weather would be like. Are there any mannerisms that you notice in yourself that reminds you of someone from your past? Think about how you get to work, or look forward to work, or pay your bills, or how much things cost. There are some great currency generators, currency converter generators online, so you can look up things from, say the 18th century, but other times too. There are a lot more for the 19th century. There's a bunch for the 18th century, and the National Archives of England have some that will even go back into the 17th century, and it'll say what the buying power, the purchasing power of a certain amount of money is. So when they give you the conversion, it'll be, what's $5 now? Well, it was worth, $26, $27 then, but $27 then would buy you 3 goats. So it's a really nice way of looking at exactly how much money things cost, and what people were spending their money on at the different time periods. So here's an example of how important it is to consider these things for that reader. I do 18th century historical reenactments. Pre-pandemic, we worked with museums to teach about 18th century maritime history. I'm the ship's doctor. I often teach young kids about medicine during the time. This one time, I'm teaching this young boy, he's about 6 or 7, and we're talking about wound care. And I'm explaining that you could put oatmeal over the cut, or if it was a deep cut, you could put a salve of fat and turpentine rose oil on it, and then you wrap it up with a piece of cloth. And he looked at me and he was just perplexed. And after a good 30 seconds, he said, when I get a cut, I just put on a Band-Aid. And then we talked about Neosporin and why we use Band-Aids, so that he could understand that the end goal was the same, to protect and close the wound and then cover it to protect it from the elements. All right. Well, all writing takes some sort of research. Writing historical fiction in the digital age adds an extra level of complexity. The accessibility of the internet has changed what readers expect from historical fiction. Before the internet, most historical fiction could just take place in a famous locale. Write a story, call it a day. This could have been a city like London or Philadelphia or a place like Notre Dame. Characters and plot lines could have come in contact with, historical events or people or not. Before access to the internet became a common and oftentimes daily occurrence, you didn't necessarily need to worry about other subject matter experts. You could write historical fiction with the confidence that most people would not be able to identify when you deviated from the facts. However, now, regular people will fact check your work. Therefore, it's a good idea to have a bibliography, even if you're not directly quoting the sources. This will give you some literary protection in case people start fact-checking your work or discussing it on social media, but don't be intimidated by this. If people are discussing what's not correct about your work, it means they've read your work. If people have a strong enough emotional reaction to your work to critique it, it means you influenced them, you affected them, you made them feel something. Those are marks of good authors. You're doing your job. You're doing a great job, even if they don't appreciate it or even if they don't agree with your perspective on it. There's both power and freedom behind the fiction part of historical fiction. You can easily explain any issues that are taken with your work as author's prerogative. Additionally, you can point out that it is fiction. If you're going to use the "it is fiction" defense, be sure that you want to be known for your story, plotline, characters, etc., and not the research that you put into building the world in which it takes place. People remember and they talk. I've learned. There we go. So we talked about the 7 elements of historical fiction in theory. I just wanted to kind of go over them in practice. I do hope that I'm not going to give away too much of my book and that you're not going to be interested because you know all the, how it was written and the behind the scenes work. But I do want to say that my book is available on Amazon. It's available in 2 places. Ignore the Amazon Marketplace third-party seller price. The book should cost $14.95 for paperback and $9.99 for Kindle. It does not cost $902. I've talked to my publisher about it. They didn't put it up there. They can't take it down. Don't pay that much. I'm not going to get any of it. It helps nobody. The book is $15. So I knew that I wanted to set my book in 18th century America during the American Revolution. So there were things I had to keep in mind. There were still British citizens living here. There were still British people working here. Of course there were. We were still a British colony. There were some people who were very unhappy with the way the colonies were being treated by the king and parliament. And there were some people that believed this is just the way colonies were treated. But America looked different too. So I traveled to as many places that I could that still had the 18th century look. I worked in Philadelphia, so walking around Old City was a great place for inspiration. I also went to Brandywine, Pennsylvania, Jockey Hollow, New Jersey, and Morristown National Park, which is right next to Jockey Hollow. I went to Williamsburg, Virginia, and Tarrytown, New York. From this, I really started to understand the architecture of the buildings and how cobblestone felt under my feet and how hard it is to walk in heels in wet cobblestone. I took a carriage ride so I could hear the horses' hooves clip-clopping down the cobblestone streets. I hung out in the rain without an umbrella so that I could hear how it landed on the roads and the bricks and the trees. And that way, when I wrote about it, I knew exactly what the touch, sound, and smell sensations were that I was trying to get across to my reader. as I'd mentioned before, I knew that I wanted to write a story about the American Revolution with a strong female lead. Working in my passion for the history of medicine was easy. Domestic remedies was medicine that women were expected to use to take care of their family. These home remedies could be as simple as removing splinters or treating sunburn, or as complex as removing bugs from ears. This is where the term earworm comes from. They're real, they're gross. Uh, Women could have been known for, splinting limbs and pulling teeth, sewing stitches. They were expected to know how to treat all manner of ailments because many towns didn't have a doctor, and it was rare that most people went to see one. Books that included home remedies were typically passed down between the generations, but there were also books such as Buchan's Domestic, which were written by physicians who wanted home remedies to be as effective as possible and to evolve as medicine of the time period was evolving. The overarching theme of Forgotten is someone growing into more than they were ever expected to be. It's not quite an underdog story because the reason for the growth is survival, not to thrive in the face of adversity. So I needed to show how my main character, Abigail, grew as she learned more about medicine, about men, and about herself. I wanted to add a little more information about how to get to know your characters. Like I said, I know I'm speaking to a writer's group, but I've been told that the way I do it is a little strange. So I wanted to impart it on you in case you haven't come across it yourselves. To me, characters are a funny thing. Even though they originate and evolve into being in our minds, they often take on a life of their own. Many times the characters will start talking to me at least. And I feel that it's my responsibility to get to know them like a new friend. The artist Michelangelo once said, "The sculpture is already complete within the marble block before I start my work. It's already there. I just have to chisel away the superfluous material." This is the way I feel about writing. When you're researching what your character or characters would be wearing or where they'll be living, I find it helpful to let them pick what they want to wear and where they want to live or how they feel about a certain conflict. Just write down the ideas that they give you, and you'll find that they'll basically tell you the story that they want you to tell. The way that they tell you is in their voice, and you can add your dialogue so that each person or character can be differentiated by the reader. Personally, I can tell when a character is ready to be written when I hallucinate them walking across my living room. If this seems like an odd concept, I suggest watching The Man Who Invented Christmas. It's available on Amazon Prime. It's about Dickens writing A Christmas Carol. If you watch the trailer, it'll actually show you exactly what I'm talking about when he develops Scrooge. But I do suggest watching the whole movie. It's very writer-centric, and it shows a lot of what the processes that I'm talking about. So my main character, Abigail Jones, is basically the narrator that walks the reader through the story. The fact that she's in the camp of the Continental Army gives the reader a behind-the-scenes look at what it may have been like to have been there. Along the way, she meets up with various other types of characters. Some were real and famous, like George Washington, Henry Knox, and Alexander Hamilton. Some are real and not famous. I had found the regiment roles for some of the militia groups that served in the Continental Army. So I was able to research into their bibliographic information and use them as, contextual side plots. Some characters were compilations of people who existed. For example, the lead physician in my book was based off of Samuel Stringer. Samuel was the director of hospitals in the north of the Continental Hospital Department from 1777 to 1783, which is about the same year span of my book. And others were based off people that I know. There's a character based off of my brother. He hates it. And then there were just some that I made up completely. While it might seem obvious that the conflict in a book about the American Revolution would be the war, it's not the case in Forgotten. Instead, most of the conflict is internal. Abigail's internal struggle relates to how she's changing and growing. Other characters have their concerns and fears in relation to the war or life and death, family issues, fears of loss, things like that. Historical fiction in movies and television get a lot of flack for being historically inaccurate, but you never know where they can lead you. About 5 years ago, I was watching Master and Commander. I'd seen the movie at least 400 times before that. I love this movie. I watch it all the time. Well, that day I was cleaning, so I wasn't really paying attention to it. And I caught a throwaway line about one character talking to the other about when a sailor dies, they stitch up your hammock with the last stitch going through the guy's nose in case he wakes up. And some part of me went, wow, that would be really awful to be like buried alive at sea and that they had to check on that. I wonder if that's true. Yes, very true. True. This is true during the War of 1812, which is where, when Master and Commander is supposed to take place. It was true through the 18th century. It was true through part of the 17th century. The more I looked up about that, the deeper and deeper and deeper into the new rabbit hole I went until I got my master's. My master's thesis came out of this, and so did my book, the new book. So you never know where historical fiction can send you, and even if you're interested in a weird throwaway line in a movie you've seen 100 times before. So I want to thank all of you for letting me speak tonight. I'm happy to have been a diversion for you, and I'm open to answering any questions that you might have.